Because Washington had great virtue, and that's why this is also important, why the inaugural address was important, because he was a great man, a great hero. So you've got this man here who was concerned about the Constitution, and all these bureaucrats in Washington today doing great damage to the Constitution, great damage to you, the people. Who's he giving honor to? Himself? No. Think of how much more Washington's accomplished than the bureaucrats today. Think of the greatness he did versus the damage they've done. Looking for continued favor and blessing. This is a man of humility who could have been arrogant and proud, but he wasn't. Right here, up front, beginning, he's saying virtue's important, morality's important to a nation. Restoring men and history. George Washington's inaugural. Why is it important? Well, it's really important for you men. First of all, he was a great hero, a great man, founding father. The father of our country, actually. What did Washington say in his first inaugural address? What did he set up? What president did he set up? Well, first of all, he's the one who just decided to do it. It wasn't written in there. It was in New York. It was in the Senate. Did he mention God? Did he mention providence? What president was set in the Senate that day in the first inauguration? A nation where men are taught God in the home with freedom, taught love your neighbor. Here's Washington, an excellent man and a hero with great virtues. This is the first inaugural and shows you how important God and divine providence was to Washington and the new nation. He sets it up right away. And you can see how certain factions tried to misinterpret the First Amendment. Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion. What they wanted to do was never establish a national church or national religion like the Church of England had. But America was based on Christian principles, and his first inaugural has God all the way through it. We would appreciate it if you would subscribe and help us build better, stronger men. And here's his first inaugural. Does it have God in it? Does it have God all the way through it? Because people have been confused on the First Amendment because of that faction, on the separation of church and state. And you actually had some states with state religions back then, so obviously it didn't prevent a state from posting the Ten Commandments or someone praying on a football field or a coach praying on a football field. None of that was meant by the First Amendment at all. They had a Bible in Congress. We could go through that. Actually, that's another whole thing. I want to stick with the inaugural, but we'll come back and do a whole video on that part of the First Amendment. But the point is this. I want to stick with his inaugural address. And by reading the primary source and his real inaugural address, you can tell what he meant, what they meant. So listen to this, and we'll start out with a virtue. And at the beginning of this document, now remember, this is a man who's been in a war over 8 years, and he's been home for a little bit, back to his farm. He's fought hard, and he's defeated the British Empire. So he could be a proud man. He could be a humble man. He could be an arrogant man by this point in life. Called the richest man in Virginia. Won and defeated the British Empire, the general of the army. Exalted and venerated by his troops, his men, his other generals. Very beloved, Washington. So he could have a huge ego and arrogance. He's just been elected president as well. So think about, already been general, already ran a successful business and farm, has a great marriage. This is what he says. Listen to his humility. This is a great virtue for men to have, why we're looking at it too. Because Washington had great virtue, and that's why this is also important, why the inaugural address was important, because he was a great man, a great hero. On the one hand, I was summoned by my country, whose voice I can never hear, but with veneration and love, a man who loves his country already, right? And he did. That's true. From a retreat which I had chosen with the fondest predilection, and in my flattering hopes with an immutable decision, as the asylum of my declining years, a retreat which was rendered every day more necessary as well as more dear to me by the addition of habit to inclination and frequent interruptions. Anyway, here's the point. He'd already been serving and fighting 8 years. He didn't really want to go there. He does it for country, for honor. This is why he left the farm. And he's very different than men of today, right? Than many men. If you think about it, think about the difference. On the other hand, the magnitude and difficulty of the trust to which the voice of my country called me. See, it's a calling, an honor. He goes for that other ancient virtue of honor. So already you've seen he has honor and he has humility. A real hero who serves with the thought of serving you, the people. Now, how many reps today do that? I mean, you've got all these people who plan in high school and college to go to law school, to then to become state assemblymen, to then become state senators, to become U.S. congressmen, and they stay in all their lives. He was trying to get away from it. He's a man who walked away from power. That's just one great factor of George Washington. He walked away from power. Patrick Henry didn't want to be going to New York. He wanted to go to his farm. Washington, too, both great Virginians, Patrick Henry and Washington, wanted to go to their farms. Washington felt called. Alexander Hamilton had said, "You've got to go. You got to do this, or we're not going to have a nation." So Washington says, "Okay." That's why he ran. That's why he became president. And for the second term, Jefferson and Hamilton had to convince him to run for the second term. He didn't want it. He wanted to go back to his farm. Very noble man. Didn't want power. Here's the point and difference of today. Look at how all of these guys stay in for decades. And they increase the debt and do a horrific job for you, the people, right? Because we don't want to go into inflation and debt. But the point is, what have they accomplished except spending way past the taxes they take in? So there should never be any taxes. But anyway, let's get back to the inaugural. The point is, they walk away, some of them, with millions and millions of dollars from just serving in the U.S. Congress. Whereas Washington spent his own money to be a general, spent his own money for the country. Very different. He was a servant leader, Washington. A great hero. Very different than today. Think about how many want power today versus Washington giving up power. He was a man who could have stayed in there forever if he wanted. Being sufficient to awaken in the wisest and most experienced of her citizens a distrustful scrutiny into his qualifications, could not but overwhelm with despondence one who, inheriting inferior endowments from nature and unpracticed in the duties of civil administration, ought to be peculiarly conscious by his own deficiency. He's talking about himself and all his deficiencies. Now think about this humility. And humility is a great virtue. He's just ran the war. They were underfunded. He had to come up with food. He had to feed the troops. He had to train the troops. They were untrained and undisciplined when he started. It's not like he had this phenomenal, well-trained army with lots of supplies. Remember crossing the Delaware, they didn't have shoes and were bloody in the snow, remember? So I've told that in the groups, but not here. So anyway, we'll go back and tell that story next Christmas. But they didn't have shoes. They were bloody in the snow. They didn't have supplies. They weren't well equipped. They weren't well trained. So this is great humility, unpracticed in the duties of civil administration. He just ran a whole war with limited supplies. That's a man of humility, right? Smallpox, inoculations. He had to figure it all out. That was Washington. In this conflict of emotions, all I dare ever is that it has been my faithful study to collect from my duty from a just appreciation of every circumstance by which it might be affected. All I dare hope is that if, in executing this task, I have been too much swayed by a grateful remembrance of former instances, or by an affectionate sensibility to this transcendent proof of the confidence of my fellow citizens, and have hence too little consulted my incapacity, as well as disinclination for the weighty and uncharacterized. That's a man of great humility just now. Look at that. It's all about how himself and its consequences be judged by my country with some share of the partiality. So that's humility. It's a great man of humility. This man has accomplished so much. Now compare him to the bureaucrats of Washington who've done so much damage unconstitutionally. So you've got this man here who was concerned about the Constitution, and all these bureaucrats in Washington today doing great damage to the Constitution, great damage to you, the people, who are arrogant. Think of when they go before the Congress. Think of the man writing the speech today here, and the humility in his heart and mind and soul, versus the bureaucrats you've seen testify before Congress, or some of the senators talking down to you in an arrogant way. Some of the people that are supposed to be servants that talk down to you. So let's move on. Such being the impressions under which I have in obedience to the public summons, he was summoned. They wanted him to do it. Repaired to the present station, it would be peculiarly improper to omit. What's he not want to omit? And this first official act. So this is the first official act of him. My fervent supplications to whom? Who's he going to talk about here? This sets the tone for the whole country. He's the first president. This is the first inauguration. This is the way it's going to go. It wasn't written that he would give one, and he just gave one. And who does he give the credit to? Himself? This guy just won the war. He could say, I'm great. I just won the war. I'm the man. I'm the myth. I'm the legend. I just defeated the greatest empire in the world. This could have been a speech. I just defeated the greatest empire in the world. Thank me. I'm phenomenal. But he doesn't do that. He says this. In this first official act, and my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe. So right away, he admits someone else is sovereign, not him. He's not in control. God's in control. You notice what he's doing here? In the first inauguration. This is probably why this isn't read much, right? Because there's a faction that wants complete separation of state and church and doesn't think you can even mention God. You can't have the Ten Commandments anywhere. You can't put it in a state. So right away, he starts with God in where? Is he in a federal building? He's in the Senate, right? Not at his home. He's in the Senate doing this. So the First Amendment never meant you can't talk about God in the Senate, right? You can't have a Bible in the Senate. That's not what it meant. Of course, you can have a Bible, and of course, you can do prayer in the Senate. This is the first president. He was there when they wrote the Constitution. He knew Madison. For Madison was a Virginian. He was a Virginian, right? Which presides in the councils of nations and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, that his benediction may consecrate to the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States, a government instituted by themselves for these essential purposes. What purposes? Happiness and liberty, right? And what gives you happiness? He'll say later. Happiness and liberty. And they knew that back then, right? They talk a lot about the pursuit of happiness. So who's he looking to for help? Keep this nation going. Who's he giving honor to? Himself? No. God. And may enable every instrument employed in this administration to execute with success the functions allotted to his charge. In tendering this homage to whom? Himself? No. To the great author of every public and private good. See how much credit he gives to God there? He could say, and a little bit to me, a lot to me, and a little bit to God. A little bit of public good and a little bit of private good is God. We'll give God a little credit. But he says every public and every private good. Credit goes where? Homage goes where? Look up to God. That's what he's saying. This is pretty strong. This is pretty important. Why is this important? So that's strong and clear. Again, this is a great man who's accomplished so much. Think of how much more Washington's accomplished than the bureaucrats today. Think of the greatness he did versus the damage they've done. I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments not less than my own, nor those of my fellow citizens at large less than either. No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than those of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency. Remember, what they've done, and they've just defeated the greatest empire, and he's giving all the credit to God, the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men, and that God has made America. Every step is what? Every step distinguished by some token of providential agency. Who gives credit like that today in government? To the bureaucrats? To the senators and reps? Maybe some, but do they give it like this? Especially for him, who's accomplished so much, right? Soldier, successful businessman, planter, farmer, and he gives God all the credit. And in the important revolution just accomplished in the system of their united government, the tranquil deliberations and voluntary consent of so many distinct communities from which the event has resulted cannot be compared with the means by which most governments have been established without some return of pious gratitude. God-fearing, right? So here's another virtue he's got. And we already know he has courage. We'll go into that in another video, because he led from the front at Princeton, led from the front when they crossed the Delaware, led from the front. Gratitude. And we all need gratitude, right? So another great virtue that Washington has, and he was always focused. He wrote a book where he was focused on these virtues and becoming a better man. We want to be 1% better each year, right? And all of these things, courage and the virtues. Washington wanted to be better too. Rules of Civility was a book he wrote, and he kept track, and he went over it all the time. Went through it. We'll read some of those sometime. But pious gratitude, God-fearing, religious gratitude, right? He has that here. He writes about it. Along with a humble anticipation of the future blessings which the past seemed to presage. These reflections arising out of the present crisis have forced themselves too strongly on my mind to be suppressed. Now, he saw it. He went through it. It's become enforced on his mind, forced themselves strongly on his mind. He went through it. He didn't get hit by bullets where he should have been hit sometimes. He saw God's hand protecting him. In the French and Indian War, he should have been shot, some say. Bullets in his coat. Princeton, the Battle of Princeton, one of the soldiers put his hands down. He thought Washington was going to be shot. Washington was on his horse. So there was divine protection of Washington, and he saw it in himself. And he saw it with the country. America came out. So he expressed that providence, and he's expressing it here in his first inaugural. You will join with me, I trust, in thinking that there are none under the influence of which the proceedings of a new and free government can more auspiciously commence. So he's saying it because of God's hand. And we're starting out what? How are we starting out? Very promising, because God's hand's on us. He does not stop there, though. He keeps going on. So on another, that the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of what? What are the immutable principles going to be? Here he says it, of private morality and the preeminence of free government be exemplified by all the attributes which can win the affection of its citizens and command the respect of the world. Free government, and one that by all attributes can win the affections of the citizens. Are bureaucrats winning your affections? Are the people, the Congress, who's spending so much money, winning your affections? He was worried, concerned about it. Winning the affections, the virtues, morality. Are they spending frugally? Are they spending well? Or are they spending crazily? Well, we know the answer. They're spending crazily, and they don't have the money. There should never be a tax, because they always spend more. I dwell on this prospect with every satisfaction which an ardent love for my country can inspire. He really loved America. Since there is no truth more thoroughly established than that there exists in the economy and course, and this is big, of nature, an indissoluble union between what? What's he going to say makes it work? What's an indissoluble union between? And this is what he says: indissoluble union between virtue and happiness goes together. Virtue gives you happiness. So young men, older men, you want happiness? Act with virtues. Build virtues. This is what Washington's saying. And for the country, the republic can't stand without morality and virtue. Where does it have to be taught? In the home, right? It has to be taught in the home. So it's linked. So right here at the beginning of the nation, this is why this is important. Right here, up front, beginning, he's saying virtue is important, morality is important to a nation. Are we teaching virtue in the homes? Are we teaching God in the homes? Are we making sure children know that virtues are important to their own happiness and that there's a reason to have virtue? He's saying it here. Virtue equals happiness. They go together. Are we teaching that? Then he says between duty and advantage. Notice he mentioned duty. We don't talk about that now. Between the genuine maxims of an honest and magnanimous policy and the solid rewards of public prosperity and felicity, since we ought to be no less persuaded, and this is just fantastic, that the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. How about that, Jack Marino? Do you hear that one, Jack? The eternal rules of order and right. Again, this is all said in the Senate. So smiles of heaven cannot be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven has ordained. So he's saying, nation better look up and pay attention and not disregard those eternal rules, or you're not going to be blessed by God, right? Are we doing that today, Jack? John, are we doing that? I'm just talking to some of the guys in the group. Are we doing that? I'm asking you on video. You can answer at home. Are we a nation obeying the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained? God made them male and female, right? That's it. Right, Jack? Right, John? God made them male and female. Now, we finally got it back to the states, where Texas never should have been stripped of their authority for abortion. Federalism. So that the states have their sovereignty so we can all get along. 10th Amendment. Going on. And since the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered, perhaps as deeply as finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of whom? Who's the experiment entrusted to? And this is important as well. The experiment is entrusted to us, to you. We have to protect the experiment. And he ends again with God. And listen to this. This is the focus all the way through on God. Having thus imparted to you my sentiments as they have been awakened by the occasion which brings us together, I shall take my present leave, but not without resorting once more to the benign parent of the human race and humble supplication, that since he has been pleased to favor the American people with opportunities for deliberating in perfect tranquility and dispositions for deciding with unparalleled unanimity on a form of government for the security of their union and the advancement of their happiness. So his divine blessing may be equally conspicuous in the enlarged views, the temperate consultations, and the wise measures on which the success of this government must depend. So the first inaugural address, why is it important? It has its focus looking up and on God, looking to prayer, looking for continued favor and blessing. This is a man of humility who could have been arrogant and proud, but he wasn't. Look at how a faction of people try to confuse people about that First Amendment and secondly, Christian principles. And in this inaugural, in this president, you can see how far we've gone away, right? Some states had a state religion. So how could you possibly not be allowed to put the Ten Commandments up? But let's go on. It must be taught in the homes. We have an unconstitutional Department of Education that is forcing their values on children. That is unconstitutional. We need to end the Department of Education so that the states do their constitutional duties. Now, here's a question, and we'll end with this. What do George Washington, and the members of Congress do after he gives this address? So after he gave the address, what do they do? This is from the National Archives. After the address, he and the members of Congress proceeded to St. Paul's Church for divine service. A brilliant fireworks display in the evening ended the official program for the historic day. So they went to the service from Congress after it, you see? So the original documents allow you to hear the actual words of Washington himself and the start of this country. It's important to know it for you men. Men need to know this to protect your what? Freedom. Virtue is important to a nation. Morality, Washington says it here, it must be taught in the homes. That makes America work. And he knows God's hand was on America and believed in God and providence. And believed heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right which heaven itself has ordained. Forging stronger men, better thinkers, and groups of men and fellowship. Thank you. If you like this video, please subscribe, hit the like button, comment. We would appreciate it.